Living Transplant is a podcast that takes you behind the scenes at the transplant program at Toronto General Hospital with the goal to educate, inspire, and fuel your passion about transplant. I'm your host, Candice Coghlan. I'm thrilled to have you join me for Season 5. In this episode of the Living Transplant podcast, I was joined by Vanessa Tait, a Cree woman from O-Pipon-Na-Piwin Cree Nation who put her heart and soul into supporting her father Kenneth through his kidney health journey. She uprooted their lives to move from her father's home community of O-Pipon-Na-Piwin Cree Nation over 700 kilometers north of Winnipeg to the city to access dialysis, as there were no hemodialysis machines and no capacity to do home dialysis with the lack of access to large amounts of water needed. While in Winnipeg, Vanessa was his primary caregiver. We spoke about their journey together, the medical barriers they and many other First Nations patients face, and the decision for Vanessa to give the gift of life, a kidney, to her father, despite his chances of survival being long, so he could live his days out in community, surrounded by loved ones. We were later joined by Dr. Michael Anderson from the urban Indigenous community in Toronto. He is Mohawk, Bear Clan, and mixed European with family roots in Tyendinaga Mohawk territory. He practices surgical oncology and palliative care medicine and is the strategic lead for Indigenous health at the University Health Network. We spoke about ethical Indigenous community healthcare research partnerships, grief, healing, and Indigenous conceptualizations of death and dying. A note to our listeners, this episode comes with a content warning as we discuss death, dying, and palliative care. We also discuss barriers to care for Indigenous communities. This is simply to empower you, our audience, with the knowledge that you may need to make healthy decisions about how or if you should consume this podcast content. If you need resources or support, you can visit the Hope for Wellness helpline, which offers immediate help to all Indigenous people across Canada, available 24/7 with immediate support and crisis intervention. You can call the toll-free helpline at 1-855-242-3310. Or you can connect to the online chat at hopeforwellness.ca. You can also reach out to the Bereaved Families of Ontario organization at www.bereavedfamilies.net or call them at 416-440-0290. Thank you.
Welcome back to the Living Transplant podcast. I have an amazing guest here today with me, Vanessa Tait. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm wondering if you can let our audience know a little bit about yourself.
So, Tanse, my name is Vanessa Tait. I'm originally from O-Pipon-Na-Piwin Cree Nation, also known as South Lake, a small northern community here in Manitoba. I'm also, however, I do reside in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in Treaty 1 territory. Again, my community is Treaty 5 territory, so that's where I come from.
Amazing. And you have shared your journey through our Great Actions Leave a Mark campaign and a lot of the incredible other media that you've done and a beautiful documentary as well. But I'm wondering if you can take us back, and for those people who don't know about you, if you could talk to us a little bit about your father, Kenneth's health journey.
So my dad was diagnosed with diabetes in 2007. So he was 45 years old when he was diagnosed. In October 2017, I remember my mom telling me that he was getting really sick. And so on October 2017, they did actually send him from my community of South Indian Lake, which is a 12-hour drive north of Winnipeg. So we do have to come to Winnipeg to see specialists. So he had a biopsy of his kidney. And at that time, his kidney was at 15% function. So you could see how there was not a lot of opportunity to correct that, because at that point he was already at 15%. He did come to Winnipeg for kidney school. So my mom and him came, and I also participated in that. That evening when he was feeling very ill, they had to jump a flight home, but we do have a connecting flight in Thompson, Manitoba. So when they did get to Thompson, that is where my mom said, your dad can't even lift his head. He's not feeling very well. And I remember she called me, and then I told her, I said, we'll take him to emerge. Like, it doesn't sound very, very good. And so I guess that November 29th, if I date back of 2017, and so you could see from the biopsy to when his kidneys had failed on his way home, that wasn't a long, stint. From 15%, the function did decrease quite, drastically. So he was kept in Thompson General Hospital because they were unsure what was going on, what was happening with my dad. But I kept telling my mom, tell him, like, his kidneys probably failed. And I repeatedly said that, and basically his body started to retain a lot of fluid. So I remember December 3rd. So that was about, I guess, 5 days later, they did life flight him to Winnipeg. And I remember I met my mom at ICU at 11:30 p.m. because at that point my dad's lungs were also filling up with fluid. So we weren't even too sure if he was going to survive. They had him in an induced coma already for quite some time. So he did go on a 24/7 cycler. And I could see my dad's body slowly, getting thinner and thinner. I think they removed about 19 liters of fluid, if I'm correct. But
Oh
they
my
removed,
goodness.
yeah, they removed quite a lot of fluid and he was still in an induced coma. So to have your, father have all these machines hooked up to him, and it was a really scary process for my family. And I know, like I said, we lived 12 hours away from Winnipeg, and I know that my brother and his family came to Winnipeg to be with us. But at that time too, we were staying in hotels. During that time he was in the coma. His father, my dad's dad, actually passed away.
Oh
So
my
my dad
goodness, I'm so
was
sorry.
in a coma when his father passed away. So it was like a lot of I guess there was just a lot our family was going through, and we really couldn't leave my dad because he too was fighting for his life. So I do remember on December 16th, falling again. You could see 13 days he was in the hospital. So that's when he was discharged from the hospital, and the hemodialysis journey started. So in that time, we were already told as a family that my dad would have to remain in Winnipeg to undergo hemodialysis. There just was no other choice. There's again, the Thompson location, the nearest location for my community, had a large wait list. So we had to think fast. So basically I had to get an apartment building, and I started, my mom stayed here for a bit, and I started that journey of taking care of my dad through his hemodialysis journey.
And can I ask you, you summarized it very quickly, but I'm sure those days during that journey when your dad was in a coma felt like forever. And you went through such a process together while he was not aware of what was going on around him, while you guys were there, fighting for him and around him and supporting him and going through the grief of losing his father as well, not knowing that. How did you deal with that as a family?
So basically, I again, we're very close knit family, so it was just supporting each other. And my mom is definitely a huge, I guess, a stronghold in our family because she prays a lot. She's someone who keeps us together. Keep taking care of each other. Pretty much just having our mom, having my brother, having his children, his grandchildren around him, and then also two community members would send donations, help us out in that way as well too. So we, within our First Nations culture, within our community, when something like that happens, we don't have that nuclear I guess perspective of things. I guess like a ripple effect, everybody supports and everybody's around you. So having that faith and having that belief and having that prayer and having that like culture and that ceremony behind everything, that spirit of everything is what really kind of just kept us going. And definitely also to within the healthcare system, you do meet people who are very compassionate. Obviously, we also have people who are not so compassionate. So I recall, a few of the ICU nursing staff. Like there was one that was just was amazing, and I will always remember them. And they just helped in the whole process. They were just there as a person as well too. Yes, they were there as a nurse, but just realizing that what we were going through.
Wow. Yeah, that makes all the difference when they show up as a human instead of just what their badge says, right? Especially in those moments that are really hard for you as a family.
Yes, definitely. And of course, like I said, we did meet some of the systemic racism and discrimination as well too. But again, with my family, we just never allowed that to get in the way of what we needed and why we were there as well too.
So talk to me a little bit about, you mentioned that transition, once your dad was awake and strong enough that he could leave the hospital, you now had this barrier that you had to move and uplift both of your lives to come to be close to the hospital so he could dialyze. What was that like?
So for myself, I was in Winnipeg. So both my parents had to relocate for this time being. I myself didn't have my own place, so that was my transition, was to transition to get a 2-bedroom apartment so that both me and my parents could live in. So that was just trying to again, and I recall we had already done that while he was in the hospital because we knew that we had to. And I remember that while my dad, we actually did it while he was in ICU, and I said, okay, well, we're gonna have to get an apartment. So I looked at the same time I was doing that while we were there, and we did get approved for a 2-bedroom. However, we didn't have no furniture. So I remember the first night, my family kind of just slept on the floor in the living room on the rug, and we just had, like, my brother did bring a few blankets and pillows, and that was just what we had to do. And we were together for the whole process because my mom had a full-time job back home. She had to again take a leave from work to be with us. She was with us for a bit before she had to go back to work. And then so there was that transition back to just me taking care of my dad. I also had a full-time job. But I also, so what I did is I tried to schedule my dad's like dialysis around my work schedule. And I transported him to his dialysis as well too, because again, if you've not heard, but a lot of our Indigenous people, First Nations people are discriminated against with taxi cab companies as well too. And for me, I just didn't, I just wanted to make sure that he went from point A to point B. And, after someone's dialyzing, they actually are pretty weak. And when the times for the first little bit, I actually went to sit with my dad because he had the evening dialysis. I would sit with my dad for 4 hours while he was on dialysis, and it's a scary process. Like, even for me, when I first saw like the blood coming out and being pumped through this machine, I was like, oh my goodness. And it just seeing what a person has to go through while they're on dialysis and while they're dialyzing for 4 hours, the leg cramps, the pain, the sugar dropping. It was just like, I was like, my eyes were so wide open. And also being in the space where there is not only my dad dialyzing, but quite a few people. I was like, there was quite a few people in that room. And so yeah, so I did that for a little bit. And but however, again, I was not, my body wasn't used to it as well too. My mind wasn't used to this whole transition and shift and change. And so 3 months later, I think it was about 3 months later, I had to actually call my mom back. I said, I'm tired. It's like, I can't, I feel like I'm starting to get, really tired and really weak because I'm like working, I'm taking my dad to dialysis. I wanted to do it, and I had the means to do it, but it was just like my body was like, what is going on? So my dad was on hemodialysis, so he did switch to transition to peritoneal dialysis because we talked about how do we get my dad back home. So how do we because he wanted to go home. because when you come from a northern community surrounded by nature and, you know, with your grandchildren and, you know, with your family and just that shift and that change to a busy city life, and the only reason why you're here is to take you from home to dialysis and back home. There's not a lot of, again, being in an apartment as well too, we couldn't necessarily just go out and enjoy the weather. It was a whole change in atmosphere for my dad. Like was used to it because I lived in the city, but that whole shift and that change was really, you know, again, I'm going to say it causes, you know, depression. It causes, you know, mental health issues because of not only are you going through dialysis, and that causes, you know, a brain drain as well too, but being away from your familiar surroundings, not able to eat your traditional food. We did have, you know, people bring some stuff to us, but that wasn't on a continuous basis, and just being able to just be around the trees, because again, geographically we're different up north, and the familiarity of just like listening to sirens, the hustle and bustle of the city, and just things were just a little bit, were quite different. And I could see, you know, the shift of change in my dad and his stance, because, you know, it is quite depressing just to be in a whole other setting, let alone an urban setting, just to survive and just to keep alive, and not be in the comfort of your own home.
I remember walking into, I was a crash start, so I didn't know I had kidney disease when I was diagnosed, but walking into that dialysis unit for the first time and sitting down and seeing everybody who was in there. And you're right, it's such a brain drain, and it's so disheartening and difficult to sit in that chair for 4 hours. And I have to thank you on behalf of all of us patients, because you know, having somebody to even just sit there, even if we're sleeping during dialysis, it makes the world of difference to know that there's somebody that loves us.
For me, at that time, I could not stick the tube into the catheter. I just couldn't do it. So I remember my mom had to, but plus also too, I was still working. So when my mom was there, so she became, you know, a healthcare aide, or, you know, a healthcare nurse for my dad, because she was taking his blood pressure, you know, she was taking his sugar levels. She was also administering his medication, because my dad did have Parkinson's. So his right hand, which is his good hand, so he wasn't even able to do any of the insertion of anything. So he could not do his own peritoneal dialysis, even if he wanted to, because of his Parkinson's. But it was just like watching it every single day. Like you said, like I had a little break to go when I did go to work, and it was just like, it was good to get away. Kidney disease didn't only affect my dad, it affected the entire family, and we had to live through kidney disease from a different perspective. But again, we were still living it day to day, you know, hour to hour. And my dad had a different diet, and it was just trying to learn how to cook these foods a different way. It was just really hard to shift sometimes, but we had no choice. We didn't have a lot of choices. And like, so we came from a First Nation community, and we were from a reserve. My dad came to Winnipeg to get medical support and attention. He was not a resident of Winnipeg, because our goal was always that, you know, we need to get dad back home. Like, Winnipeg is not his home. But yet, because of that jurisdictional divide between federal, because First Nations are a fiduciary responsibility, and a provincial system, there was a lot of jurisdictional barriers that we faced. I think in my dad's journey, and looking through, going through that journey with him, I think we're about, within the provincial and federal government, we went through about 13 jurisdictions. And when I say jurisdictions, I'm talking about hospitals, different hospitals.
Oh my goodness, Vanessa.
I'm talking about different regional health authorities, from Northern Health Authority and then coming to the city. I'm talking about even within my community, we have a nursing station that is governed and administrated by the Indigenous Service Canada, which used to be the First Nations Inuit Health branch. And also, and the public health side being administered by the community through a funding agreement, going from the dialysis stuff to just different things where I was like, it was constantly like I had to constantly be retelling my dad's story because he had a heart condition, he had Parkinson's, he had diabetes, he had, he had his kidney doctor. So none of those people speak to each other. So, again, because, definitely because of confidentiality or the fear or the FIPA or whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, that's really exhausting for a family to have to continuously say, well, how do you not, have you seen this person for the past year? And why do I have to keep telling you as a heart disease? It's just was like, it was exhausting. So I learned a lot in it. When my dad transitioned to peritoneal, obviously, we had, my mom had to get the training. So she did get the training for the dialysis, peritoneal dialysis, so that they can go home. At that point, my dad was on the bed, and then he then became onto the cycler. So when they did go home, they went back home to the community. However, within the community level, there's no support for kidney disease patients. There's barely support for all other patients or all other community members who are experiencing other health conditions. The cycler has this, again, there's innovation, great, amazing innovation in dialysis modalities. However, when you go to a community that has no connectivity and the internet at that time, like things have changed now, but at that time there was no connectivity. We didn't have high-speed internet. So with the cycler, there's a USB that you hook up and, it sends documents to the doctor or the office here there in Winnipeg. So for my dad, it was, he went 3 months at home and then, he come for a checkup. So he basically did not last very long on peritoneal dialysis back home because he was having difficulties with it. He was, because, it's a bit different because when you don't have that medical support or being able to just understand with what's happening, or even being able to take him to an emergency if something happens. So I remember during my dad's peritoneal, while he was at home, he kept getting like really bad chest pains. And obviously, was told by the facility there, the nursing station, that he was just having anxiety. And, again, anxiety caused by being on dialysis. And basically, I was told that, maybe you should just go back to Winnipeg. So that was really hard for our family because one of the things is we wanted to get him home, and not having that support from a health facility in my community, again, administered by a government, was very disheartening for our family. Is just not something, that should be said to anybody, regardless of, not being able to resource or have the services, because the basic emotional support, and like I said, when I sat with my dad at dialysis, that gives dialysis and kidney patients a lot of strength and a lot of courage to keep going. And, the anxiety level comes down because you're not in it alone. And so we always made sure that my dad didn't feel like he was in it alone. So he did, they made it, they did make an appointment to discuss, like, again, the peritoneal dialysis in Winnipeg. 2018, sometime early October, he returned back to Winnipeg for hemodialysis. It wasn't very long after he actually suffered a massive heart attack when he did return back to Winnipeg. So for me, those little anxieties, little pains in his heart were actually probably leading up to this massive heart attack. So it wasn't anxiety, it was something else that was underlying. So it was really, he did undergo quadruple bypass surgery, again, and because of, again, when you're on dialysis, things change in your body, right? So when he did return to back for hemodialysis in Winnipeg, I actually already had given up the apartment. So we no longer had an apartment. So here's my dad coming back to the city. Again, no home. So when that happens, they either put you in a medical boarding home or a hotel. So for my dad, the Marlborough Hotel downtown Winnipeg, not a very good location, pretty rundown hotel. He had to stay there for a year with myself, and then my dad came back, and I was like, okay. So he stayed at the Marlborough Hotel with my mom. Like my mom kept him. But my mom again was she had to leave her job. So she went, we tried to get her on. I took over taking care of my dad again. I stayed 1 week in that hotel and I said, I am not staying in here. I could not sleep. You know, there was just, you know, it was downtown Winnipeg and there's just a lot of things that were, couldn't even go out without, you know, worrying about your safety. So just those different things that were really, and I'm like, man, Dad, you've been living here for a year. I said, I can't even stay here for a week. So there was my journey again, looking for a place for us. But this time I said, I wanted to get a house so that we could at least go outside. Yeah, so he did come, we lived together again, November 2019. So I became his caregiver, his advocate, his medical transportation, and then while maintaining a full-time job still, because we had to pay the bills, right?
So this and this and this and this, you know, stacking on top of each other, all of these responsibilities, and also trying to maintain a sense of yourself through all of it, you know,
Yes.
finding a space where you can have a breath too, right? Like one day at a time, right?
I no longer had a social life, you know, again, this was my other job was to be the caregiver, and I did not mind it, but definitely there was no time for Vanessa because it taught me a lot. My dad took me on a journey that I think, you know, one gave me a lot of understanding about what systemic racism was, gave me an understanding why the stories of our First Nations people go through like so many things within those systems. I have my master's degree and I still could not understand some of the things they're talking about. I was still faced with our family was still faced with being mistreated in there. You know, I was still faced with like my dad not having the proper healthcare, people just being blatantly racist that, you know, we're just like Indians from the reserve who have no jobs or who are, you know, it just really seeing that they didn't really humanize us. I always say kidney disease doesn't discriminate, but healthcare systems do. However, I'm going to say there was, and it's sad to say we probably, you know, past 100 people are, you know, about there. I could hold on my two hands like the 10, you know, about 10 people that I know had the most amazing hearts, you know, from healthcare aides to nurses, to some physicians, but it's still too low to say that the whole healthcare system has that mentality. And I know other people who are also not Indigenous face this as well too, and also the way we do things. You know, when my dad also had his quadruple bypass surgery, we had quite a few people come to the waiting room, and there was like I'd say about 20 of us, and that's how we do things. But the hospital system doesn't understand that. We visit, we're there, we're there to comfort my dad, and they just realizing that, you know, again, it's we're not taking up space, we're actually being who we are, and we're there to support not only my dad, but also they were there to support us, and that's who we are. But also my dad touched a lot of lives. Everyone loved my dad and everyone cared for my dad.
Vanessa, it is maddening to hear this and to know that you and your family and many others are still facing racism in a system that should be providing you with the support and uplifting you in your hardest times. And although you shouldn't have to provide that care at all, it's really beautiful to know that your father and other patients had that support of you and your family through this journey, and that you put your heart out there to ensure that he was so surrounded by love. As we talk about this journey with your father and with your family and everything that you all did to come together to keep your father healthy and to make this better for him, I'm wondering if you can bring me to that point where you have been through all of this and you decided that your next part of this journey would be looking into becoming your father's living donor.
Decided to become my dad's living kidney donor because, I always, being his caregiver and, being alongside him, I always sensed and seen a very lonely feeling towards him, that he had. So my dad was he had a very lonely spirit. So I asked him one day, I said, Dad, I said, if I put myself as a living kidney donor, would you take my kidney? I said, I done a lot of research. So then he said, well, I don't know if I want to take your kidney because what's going to happen to you? So we talked about that. And I said, I showed him a couple of different videos of other journeys. And, I really psyched myself out too, to say, okay, people are okay with just having the one kidney. So again, I asked them, I said, are you sure? I said, so then I said, well, if I don't give you my kidney, I've already, when I put my mind to something, I said, I'll probably donate it to somebody. And he was like, okay. He says, yeah, that's kind of where, and the decision was so he can go home. So he can be with his grandchildren, so he can be, on the land, so he could just be able to breathe the air of being in his own traditional territory. And that's something that's important because that's where your ancestors are. That's where, where everything that makes you who you are as a Rocky Cree or, O-Pipon-Na-Piwin Cree Nation individual, you live and breathe that in that space. So I just wanted that for him. And like I said, I knew it wasn't going to be for longevity. It wasn't about that. It wasn't about giving my dad 20 more years. Obviously that was a hope, but my dad had other chronic complications, and we knew that. I told myself, if my dad goes home for an hour because I gave him the kidney, I said, I will be satisfied. And I always say that, I gave my dad the gift of life, and that's what they call it. But I, in turn, believe that he gave me the gift of life because now, I watch what I eat, I basically know that every moment too that I walk here is important because I too, I only have one kidney. And he left me that purpose to just continue to ensure that no other Nations person has to go through this. But we're still going through it today. And we're still having to tell that story over and over again. And I've heard a story, that this has happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago. There's not a lot of things that have changed. So I think that's really ultimately what the reasoning of that living kidney donor was. And so that means something a little bit different for me. And now, I always say, for me, I already have a piece of myself in heaven, and that will in the spirit world is what I call it. And I will find my way home when it is my time to go.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Vanessa. I'm so incredibly grateful for your time today and everything that you do for other people, and the gift that you gave your dad and your family to get to go home. Dr. Michael Anderson is now going to join us, and I am so grateful to welcome you to this podcast. Dr. Michael Anderson practices surgical oncology in palliative care medicine and is the strategic lead for Indigenous health at the University Health Network. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about why you wanted to become a doctor and then what led you to focus on surgical oncology and eventually then end of life care.
One of the things that was most appealing was this notion of lifelong learning, that you're in a field, in an area that you always are learning. And I think that was one of the more appealing things about medicine, about healthcare. But I got more and more interested in death and dying and how we framed it and how we managed it in healthcare. And I also got more disillusioned with how we manage and frame death and dying in healthcare. Certainly in the era that I trained, it was hard to bring any parts of my Indigenous self into the surgical world. They weren't an easy fit in frankly, a lot of medicine. But palliative care actually seemed like a place where they would fit together better. There was an easier conversation. So I didn't like how Western medicine frames end of life and death and dying. And I do like how Indigenous communities frame death and dying.
Mm-hmm. And can you talk to me a little bit about what those views are for listeners who may not know?
Generally, there's a couple of things, one of which is the notion that death isn't an end, that birth and death are highly related. Birth is your spirit entering this world, this realm, and death is your spirit leaving this realm, which is why in a lot of traditional senses, midwives were the knowledge keepers for both birth and death, helping your spirit enter and leave this world. And also that medicine is very focused on the physical realm, but at the end of life, your spiritual realm is of so much importance. And an elder long ago told me, at the end of life, your physical self is often becoming weaker and losing energy, but it's such an opportunity for healing.
So you work at UHN. Can you tell us a little bit about the Indigenous Health Program there at UHN that was started?
Yeah, we're a fairly new program. We're a small team that's growing. I think the most important piece of sort of patient and community facing is our navigators. We have patient navigators in the cancer program. We have patient navigators in both of our emerge departments. They make an enormous difference in supporting community members, hospitals, healthcare, safer places. But we also do the work to try to change the institution and the way institutions function. And it's really easy as a healthcare worker. You live and work in these spaces. A lot of the things about them sort of fade to background. You don't even see where the problems are sometimes, where healthcare institutions can look different to different groups of people. So a lot of the work we do is also around trying to change the way the institutions function and behave.
And Vanessa, does any of that, tag you in? We've talked a lot about her father's journey and a lot of the barriers that you faced, navigating that healthcare system that was not an easy thing to do.
Looking at it from the fact of incorporating or even people having the basic understanding of Indigenous history here. Each and every single time, like I discussed earlier with my story, is that I was always faced with that judgment, that discrimination. Yet I had my master's degree, so and it just blew me away. I was like, I'm a human being, regardless, but I'm not what you perceive I am because I'm First Nation. You are painting me with a brush that's so very discriminatory, and I don't even believe that majority of our people don't drink, or there is a lot of our people that aren't on welfare. I just don't know, and they basically treated me like I was a stupid Indian is what it was, and I was like, no. So that definitely was a lot of what we kind of went through.
And Vanessa, you're echoing stuff that sadly happens all the time. People label us and they miss that more Indigenous people are abstinent, don't drink, than in the general population, but we get labeled that way. And I was in some remote communities working a couple of summers ago, and the Health Canada nurses were saying things like, hide your sharps containers and people are going to steal this. And I'm like, you don't know a thing. You've prejudged everybody. And then the trade-off is, we see all the time, people don't get their pain managed appropriately because people sit there and stigmatize that, well, you must be at risk of being an opiate, having an addiction to opioids. We're going, manage people's pain. So Indigenous folks often get undermanaged.
And how, in your opinion, do we start to create these harmonious spaces where the system that we've talked about, the Western medicine system, and Indigenous cultures can come together and collaborate and do this in a way that is beneficial for patients who are going through this journey?
I think one of the first challenges is that Indigenous voices are rarely heard in healthcare. So when we talk about, oh, we want community voices, but there's only select voices that tend to get heard. And so until the voices of people who, aren't heard start to get surfaced and start to be heard, it's hard to change a lot. So that's part of it. Is, I think, just as Vanessa referred to, there's systematic things. There's things baked into the system that have to change. I sort of find, like I said, people were often blind to them until you see them. When you so part of it is just opening your eyes, is seeing. The other side of it is building trust. Lots of people, I often use as a title for presentations, these places weren't built for us. Because one of the navigators and I were supporting a First Nations man a few years ago. And as we were walking into the hospital, that's exactly what he said. These places weren't built for us. So until you start to do the work, part of the work is in the institution, but a lot of the work is outside of the institution. It's building better relationships. It's building trust. It's doing the work. Vanessa called it right out. The biggest barrier to access to care for Indigenous people isn't distance. It's racism. It's plain and simple. When you go somewhere where you're going to be stigmatized and judged and probably treated less well, not having your pain managed as well, so on and so forth, not being treated with respect, you're less likely to want to go back. So you delay care. So when you could be going back and treating something earlier, you delay it till you're in a crisis because you don't want to encounter the racism, the stigma, the mistreatment. All those things I just said are hard for a lot of healthcare people in healthcare to hear, because they think, I'm trying to do some good. I'm not. Well, actually, you have to look at the system within which you work. I think one of the things we really try to do in certainly in our program is recognize that so many of the conversations around Indigenous folks are all deficit based. They're about, we need to flip that and go, we have so many strengths in our communities. We have strengths in our knowledges and our ways of knowing, being, and doing. We need to start to privilege and highlight the strengths rather than always focusing on the deficits.
Make steps forward in reducing the barriers that we've talked about and reducing systematic racism. And it's such a big thing to think about. When you start to think about it, it feels like there's never going to be any steps forward because it is so large. In the work that you've done so far at UHN and in your career, are there items and tangible actions that we can do in your opinion at UHN and anybody who's listening that can start that difference?
One of the things about being on a learning journey is embracing some discomfort. If you sit where you're totally comfortable, you're not learning. You're not changing. I don't mean the discomfort has to be unpleasant, but learning and looking at the world differently has an element of discomfort. You're getting out of what you know and what you think you know.
You know, we touched a little bit about it, but one thing that is often really uncomfortable for people to talk about is death. How do you support someone in either a caregiver role or the person whose life is coming to an end? How do you best support them in their end of life journey?
I might flip it, if it's okay with Vanessa, and ask her first, is what did you need in support? And I think that's because it's different for everybody.
I didn't have the medical background, but I had the compassion and I had the understanding. I would sit by my dad's bed and, you know, different things that were happening. I was like, okay, what's happening now? But I did have a palliative nurse that I could call in Thompson, that I could say, you know what, this is happening. And I remember when everything was, you know, his final stages of everything, you know, coming out of him, I was like, oh my God, he hasn't eaten for how long? What is all this stuff? So I called a palliative nurse and she basically said, I'm a palliative person. And they said that, you know, his organs are starting to, like, everything's coming out now. So you need to prepare that, you know, this is his final stages of him being with us. We're not too sure how long it's going to last. So I didn't have no hookup of a machine. So I really didn't know when my dad was going to take his final breath. And I remember, I guess for us, for me, what that journey taught me with my dad was, again, death is a part of life, but it was also a very beautiful journey for my dad. I sang the drum for him. You know, again, I smudged during the time. My mom does pray differently. She, you know, says the Lord's Prayer, and then she offers you know, again, the holy water. So we both did, you know, our thing. But also too, my dad kept telling us that the bears were coming to get him. And you know, to get out of the way, that he didn't want them to take for us to go. So just watching that transition for my dad, that spiritual transition, but just even saying, like, you know, even being able to say, you know, Dad, I forgive you for different things, and my mom being able to forgive him for certain things. Like I said, it taught me that death was a beautiful thing. And I'm actually right now currently taking an Indigenous death doula. I just started to like look into that support that we needed was just people to just come and say their goodbyes to my dad. And to really just hear people talk to my dad and tell my dad all the things that my dad did. And so this part about when my dad took his final breath was 8 o'clock in the morning on April 8th. And I remember that I heard the alarm. I will never set my alarm for 8 a.m. anymore, but it re-triggers that time. And so I was just getting out of bed and my brother was holding my dad. And I remember I said, you know, put him down. I said, he's like, I think it's time. So I laid right beside him and I saw his apple go up one last time. And I just like, and that was it. That was his final breath. And instantly, because I donated my right kidney to him, instantly my right side just felt like there was a fire burning right through me, like a heartburn. And I was like, Mom, I was like, my right side just feels really weird. And she's like, that's your body also telling you that your kidney is now, you know, journeyed on as well too. So it was a really spiritual moment with us. Lesson I learned, and I think what I take with it too is I wasn't taking care of myself, because it just, boom, grief hit me like there was no tomorrow a little after. But my body was still so like on high adrenaline rush that grief hit me 8 months later. It didn't hit me that moment. Whoa, what is this? I was like, oh, that's what I've been ignoring all these times. So families aren't able to grieve when they're being caregivers and when they're being everything. So just making sure that there's that support as well too.
I think when you asked me, you know, sort of palliative care, to me, the most useful tool in palliative care is the conversations you have. It's not about any medicine or any procedure or anything. It's about the goals of care conversation, which is a technical way of saying, asking people what they want. And it's so different. I have no idea what people want who have a life-limiting illness. So let's have a conversation. What's most important? often one of the ones which I think, Vanessa just completely highlights is people want to go home. I think that's a very human thing. They want to go home. And for people in the North, they often get moved out of their community for the technical parts of healthcare. And the problem is, okay, you moved out to get some technical parts, but we've now separated you from family. Well, death and dying is a family event. It's a community event. It's a personal event. It really shouldn't be a medical event. And when you're not able to connect to your family and your community, we've kind of robbed you of the key parts of this phase of life.
After things have settled, how do you help families who have gone through this to grieve that part of their life that is now gone, especially when it was such a big part of their journey?
So this is one of the spaces where I think Indigenous thought and how we organize ourselves and non-Indigenous world are different. The non-Indigenous world is highly focused on the individual. Indigenous world is highly focused on your relationships. So healthcare is around the individual. I'm taking care of so-and-so. I'm taking care of so-and-so. We don't frame it, or the system doesn't frame it as, no, we're supporting families and communities and what that looks like. And I even go one further, because family looks like something really different in Indigenous communities. Family isn't my blood relative, isn't my blood relatives always. It's my community, it's my kin, it's different. So in Toronto Anishinaabe Health, we have a traditional Indigenous palliative care program, and baked into that is many months of supporting family afterwards. Well, that doesn't happen in the Western healthcare system, because once the person who you're caring for dies, that relationship tends to be severed because you're not caring for the whole family. So it's structured differently. And I don't always know, I shouldn't say that it's not like clinicians wouldn't want to do that, because many would, but the system doesn't enable it. It's not built that way.
I think also too, Candice, for me, when I knew my dad was passing, I was like, oh no. So I came back to Winnipeg, went to see my friends, and they actually did a grieving ceremony to detach me from my kidney, because they said when you are a living kidney donor, you still have your buddy who's, you always, when you sit together with the person you've given a kidney to, you just feel at home. And even if it wasn't my father, it was somebody else, like that connection you still have. But the one thing I didn't do was I didn't prepare myself for if my dad died, right? So I was preparing that because I was losing so much of things in my life. I was like, okay, it was just like piling on.
I've never quite been the believer in these stages of grief, the anger, negotiation. I just think grief is complicated, and it comes, and it comes back in different ways at different times.
I had a friend who once told me, actually in the thick of when my grandmother was going through that, she said that grief is kind of like water and like the flow of the ocean, that, sometimes it is still and sometimes you're okay and you can wait out and you can just enjoy it and it's peaceful. And she said, and other times it's really rocky and choppy, and other times you get hit real hard with a big wave that, knocks you off your butt and you don't know where it came from.
When we've talked to residential school survivors about institutional spaces or in healthcare, it's interesting. Some of the things that people say are, when I walk into a hospital, the cleaning solutions, the smell of it reminds me of residential schools, or the linens, the way the linens are done and managed. So it is interesting. It's subtle things. It's different things than you'd expect that trigger memories.
Vanessa, do you have any last words as well before Mike leaves us?
Like I said, it was quite the journey with my dad, and I always think things happen for a reason, right? And my dad is still with me in the things that I do. Our community members go from diagnosis to dialysis almost in like 5 minutes. and dialysis for 20 years to end of life, right? So we don't even get that disease management, we don't get that prevention, we don't get any of those things. So again, a lot of us say this is nothing for us without us. And because COVID really showed that, and if my dad became mentally incapacitated to the point where he wasn't talking anymore, then a doctor would take ownership over my dad. But I signed a medical directive to say, no, you have to come through me. But not a lot of our families know that. So why does a system then, because that just looks back at colonialism, the Indian Act. We become, so again, even with doctors, with the healthcare system, they become now owners of my dad, but yet, and families' voices don't matter. So I asked somebody, I'm like, what can I do with this? Because a lawyer had told me that. And I was like, what?
Is there anything, Mike, that maybe we didn't talk about that you think you would like to share?
Human beings are beautiful and complicated, and there is no one journey. And I think that's a large piece of this, is asking people what they want, trying to understand what people want. I should not project onto other people what I think their journey is going to be.
Amazing. Thank you both. I'm so incredibly grateful that you gave us some of your time and your expertise and your experience. So thank you both so much. And we truly appreciate all that you do for others. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Living Transplant Podcast. If you did, please leave us a review and share with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to Living Transplant wherever you are listening today. If you have any ideas for podcast episodes, you can reach out to us at livingorgandonation@uhn.ca or on social at GiveLifeUHN. For more information about living organ donation, you can visit us at www.livingorgandonation.ca. Special thanks to Lead Podcasting for editing this episode and for production support. I'm your host, Candice Coghlan. Thanks for spending your time with us.